Natural disasters haven't subsided in China, with heavy rainfall continuing in many parts of the country. Also, President Donald Trump harshly criticized the CCP at the 75th United Nations General Assembly. He mentioned China 11 times in his speech. And also, it's now been exposed that the Chinese Communist Party has built a database that includes profiles of people outside of China, including in the United States, Australia, and Canada. I'll be interviewing CEO of Black Ops Partners Corporation, Casey Fleming, about this. Welcome back, everyone. First off, some breaking news. Now, the disasters in China, continuing our coverage on this. Authorities have noted there were 21 large-scale floods in China this year, which has been the most since 1998. The state-run Global Times reported that 833 rivers in China went above their warning levels, and 77 of these rivers reached historical flood levels. And it's not over yet. Heavy rainfall is continuing in parts of the country, and on September 22nd, water levels on the Songhua River in Harbin rose to its warning level. Alerts were sent out noting that over the next 3 days there will be heavy to moderate rains in southwestern China, central and western Jiangnan, Hebei, northwestern Shanxi, and southwestern China. New flood alerts have also been issued by the Ministry of Water Resources, which warned of coming floods on numerous large rivers across China. It also noted that some small and medium-sized rivers in China are expected to have a, quote, super alarm level of floods. Now, meanwhile, in Suzhou, a major city in Jiangsu province of East China, a large explosion was caused by a suspected natural gas leak. The surface of a road blasted open, and what appeared to be gas poured out and caught fire. Details of the incident are still not clear. Now, a notice about the explosion was posted, then deleted from the Chinese internet soon after it went up. A local gas company issued the statement in the early morning of September 23rd and said the explosion was caused by a pipe leak. It also stated the incident was still under investigation. No new details on this yet. Also, in some U.S. news, a congressional report has found that Hunter Biden, the son of Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden, engaged in millions of dollars of, quote, questionable financial transactions. It says this was done with people with ties to the Russian government and to the Chinese Communist Party. The findings are raising concerns about special interests, possible crimes, threats of counterintelligence, and possible extortion. The findings were outlined in a joint report published by the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs and the Senate Committee on Finance. This was pushed mainly by Republicans and was led by Finance Chairman Chuck Grassley and Homeland Security Chairman Ron Johnson. The report was released on September 23rd, this morning, and states, quote, the records acquired by the committee show consistent, significant, and extensive financial connections among and between Hunter Biden, James Biden, Sarah Biden, Devon Archer, and Chinese nationals connected to the communist regime and the PLA, that's the People's Liberation Army. And it says, quote, as well as other foreign nationals with questionable backgrounds. Biden campaign spokesman Andrew Bates responded by saying the investigation took time away from the government response to the pandemic and stated, quote, why? To subsidize a foreign attack against the sovereignty of our elections with taxpayer dollars, an attack founded on a long disproven hardcore right-wing conspiracy theory that hinges on Senator Johnson himself being corrupt, and that the senator has now explicitly stated he is attempting to exploit to bail out Donald Trump's re-election campaign. Grassley and Johnson responded again, saying their committees are authorized to conduct investigations like this as they related to the possible existence of corruption or unethical practices or of conflicts of interest. Now, in other news, President Donald Trump harshly criticized the Chinese Communist Party at the 75th United Nations General Assembly. He mentioned China 11 times and the Chinese government once.
We are once again engaged in a great global struggle. We have waged a fierce battle against the invisible enemy, the China virus, which has claimed countless lives in 188 countries. As we pursue this bright future, we must hold accountable the nation which unleashed this plague onto the world, China. China, the Chinese government, China's trade abuses.
And a speech contrasted with that of CCP leader Xi Jinping, who spoke in the same session. She instead criticized the United States of bullying and demanded that the United Nations, quote, do justice for China. She focused his speech heavily on the CCP virus and on global governance. He said UN members should, quote, embrace the vision of a community with a shared future in which everyone is bound together. He said also the world should work to, quote, ensure the stable and smooth functioning of global industrial and supply chains. Now, Xi's speech comes as many countries, including Japan, India, the United States, and others, are re-evaluating their supply chains and are pulling companies out of China. Now, Xi also stated, quote, we will never seek hegemony, expansion, or sphere of influence. We have no intention to fight either a Cold War or a hot war with any country. But ironically, his statements come as the CCP has been openly discussing taking Taiwan by force, has engaged in heated territorial disputes with India and in the South China Sea, did a propaganda video of them nuking Guam, and has been promoting programs to establish China as the hegemon globally under programs such as China 2025. And now for the broader stories for today. Now, first up, the Chinese Communist Party is launching a new program that rolls back the regime's programs of economic reform. In other words, the Chinese Communist Party, it appears, is abandoning its capitalist system. It's bringing back a system more closely aligned with strict party control over private business. This is a major shift for the CCP. And in this move, the CCP appears to be repeating a strategy used by former party chairman Mao Zedong, almost a direct replica of what he did. Now, the main mouthpiece news outlet of the CCP announced on September 16th that the General Office of the CCP Central Committee issued, quote, important guidelines from party leader Xi Jinping on what it called a new, quote, opinion on strengthening the united front work of the private economy in the new era. Now, the announcement was made just ahead of the National Private Economy United Front Work Conference. The new guidelines call for programs that would increase the CCP's control over private enterprises and over entrepreneurs under the United Front Department of the CCP. It states this is to, quote, better focus the wisdom and strengthen the private businessmen on the goal and mission to realize the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. I'll be explaining what that really means. It states as well that the CCP will, quote, strengthen ideological guidance and will, quote, build a core group of private sector leaders who can be relied upon during critical times. Now, the United Front Department, this is a branch of the Chinese Communist Party dedicated mostly to expanding the control of the Chinese Communist Party outside of China, again, building a united front line. Now, different communist systems also have united fronts. This is a common office of communist systems. For the CCP, typically, this is used outside of China. But here, however, again, we see the united front being used to expand CCP control inside China. And again, I'll be explaining why this is significant. What does it really mean when it says, quote, focus the wisdom and strengthen the private businessmen on the goal and mission to realize the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation? And to, quote, strengthen ideological guidance for building a core group of private sector leaders who it says can be relied upon during critical times. What does this really mean? The CCP is creating a program of ideological guidance for its business owners. These are private business owners, not state-run companies, who it says can be relied upon during critical times. In other words, the Chinese Communist Party is creating programs of control over the economic systems that are independent of the CCP, which means, again, the Chinese Communist Party may be doing away with some of the capitalist systems, getting rid of elements of the free market, rolling back things we saw done under Deng Xiaoping, and moving the CCP back closer to the days of Mao Zedong. Now, I'll be explaining this. This aligns with another policy Xi has been pushing under the narrative of, quote, comprehensive party building, in the private sector specifically. And as I briefly mentioned, this new policy is significant, at least when it comes to understanding the concerns of the CCP and its overall directions, where the Communist Party is heading. This is the first time the United Front has issued guidelines on the private sector since the economic reforms in the days of Mao Zedong. The last time we saw the CCP use the United Front for its own private sector was when Mao launched a movement to abolish private property under very similar methods. And for the CCP, this could again be a signal both of Xi moving closer to a Mao-style form of leadership and for the party itself expanding control over private businesses in China. Under Mao Zedong, the CCP used the United Front policy in 1955 and 1956 to build so-called public-private partnerships. These new guidelines under Xi can be interpreted as the CCP rolling back the economic reforms launched under former party leader Deng Xiaoping in the late 1970s and in the 1980s. In this context, this new policy could be interpreted as the CCP preparing to seize private property, and as the party bringing back the hardline Maoist system of a socialist planned economy. And in the context of rolling back Deng Xiaoping's reforms, it can also be seen as the abandonment of the former party leader's policies overall, including his approach to showing a friendly face to the West under the narrative of a peaceful rise for the CCP. This follows broader trends in the CCP around that. At the same time, it also states the policy is meant to guide China's economy through what it states are, quote, critical times. But a bit of history suggests the policy may have the opposite effect, and assuming the CCP leadership knows its history, again on the Mao-era policy that it's now bringing back, this may tell us something about their real intentions. The Chinese Communist Party's road to establishing party control over the private sector used a series of deceitful methods, and this September marks the 71st anniversary of when this began back in 1949. The Chinese Communist Party invited capitalist entrepreneurs back then to Beijing for a party conference where it passed a decree claiming the CCP needs to protect economic interests and property, including of the so-called bourgeois and the capitalists. This proved to be a ruse, however, and shortly after that, again 1949, the CCP launched its program to take over the private industry. This was right as the CCP was taking over China, establishing its rule over China, and as part of its claimed policy, it promised a state of temporary capitalism, it said at the time, for 15 to 20 years before it would begin transitioning into the stage of socialism. It called this phase the, quote, new democracy era. And that same year, Mao Zedong even promised that the party would allow for a private capitalist economy in China for a, quote, relatively long period of time. Yet just 4 years after that, the Chinese Communist Party broke that promise. And it did so under a program that is eerily similar to the one just launched by the CCP under Xi Jinping. In 1953, Mao Zedong launched a program to, quote, socialize the country's industry. In other words, to establish a system of state capitalism, as Lenin called it, or a socialist dictatorship, where again the government seizes control of the businesses, seizes the means of production. Then just as now, this was done under the CCP's United Front Work Department. The program was called the Five Antis Campaign. Under it, the CCP launched a nationwide persecution of entrepreneurs and capitalists. And through a slow boil technique, taking things one step at a time, like a frog being slowly boiled in water, it first resulted in a system of building public-private partnership in 1955 and in 1956. When the CCP established these so-called partnerships, they took the form of heavy-handed government pressure from merchants and business owners to, quote, voluntarily allow the CCP to establish joint state-private firms. Behind this, though, under again the CCP's Five Antis campaign, launched in 1952, the regime had been terrorizing business owners and had used various programs to put them in deep debt. Now, those who did not allow the CCP to take partial ownership of their businesses faced state seizures anyways of their companies, again regardless of what they did. Sometimes that involved torture and killing of business owners. But under this, Mao essentially did away with private property in China by 1956. But the lesson to history should not be forgotten here. And as the CCP leaders again are signaling the start of a very similar program, they're likely aware of the impact Mao's policy had on the Chinese economy. It plunged the country into difficult economic times that lasted until the CCP began to restore capitalist policies under Deng Xiaoping over 20 years later. That was in 1978. Under those reforms, the United Front Department effectively left the private sector in China, and it stayed that way until now. This United Front directive, launched just recently, says that Chinese business leaders are, quote, our own people, and calls on entrepreneurs in China to stay, quote, politically correct and clear-headed when it comes to recognizing the Communist Party. And just like the Mao-era policy, these guidelines encourage private business owners to join a CCP program of, quote, mixed ownership reform. Now, when I say politically correct, this is the CCP's term under Mao Zedong in 1967. That's where it comes from. The idea was if you follow the directives of the party, you are politically correct. You're following the political moral system rather than the traditional moral system. If you were politically correct, you were in line with the CCP and its policies. If you opposed it, you were not politically correct and you could be killed. Now, this new directive under that concept suggests that if Chinese business leaders don't agree to the CCP program of, quote, mixed ownership reform, as they're calling it, granting the CCP mixed ownership of their companies, then they risk being labeled as being not politically correct. This again means, tying back to these earlier concepts, many Chinese people lived through those times, right? This wasn't that long ago. Tying to these same concepts, it means that if they do not follow the CCP's directive, do not grant the CCP mixed ownership of their companies, allowing the Communist Party to take over private businesses, they risk being labeled as not politically correct. And in China, under these same concepts, again, and as the CCP is rolling back a lot of these old programs, bringing back Mao-era programs for, say, state party purges, this is tying into that exact same concept, the exact same way these things played out under Mao Zedong, and again means that their lives may be at risk if they refuse to go along with it. Now, these guidelines also ask Chinese companies to participate in the regime's Belt and Road Initiative, which is particularly interesting since projects under the program are usually controlled by top CCP leaders, who control generally the energy and financial sectors. And the program is seen partly as a way of these CCP leaders to expand their own fortunes. And while some companies aren't state-owned in the Belt and Road Initiative, like CEFC China Energy, they still often depend on their close ties to CCP leaders. Beyond personal interests of party leaders, the Belt and Road Initiative is also a way for the Chinese Communist Party to expand mega project programs outside of China, which it uses inside China and abroad to artificially inflate its economy, and also use debt traps and other deceptive methods to seize foreign assets. Now, taken into the broader context, as the Chinese Communist Party renews a united front program to take over parts of its private sector, this signals that not just the CCP reverting back to more hardline Maoist policies, but also that the CCP is declaring a crisis for the party. It says a lot about the state of the Chinese economy right now. Now, folks, as we recently reported, it's now been exposed that the Chinese Communist Party has built a database that includes profiles of people outside of China, including of Americans, Australians, Canadians, and others. The profiles allegedly include as well politicians, business leaders, academics, and others the CCP may be interested in targeting. Now, it's important to note this verifies an exclusive story I published in the Epoch Times back in 2016, which exposed the existence of this database the CCP had built on Americans. The story included an interview with an engineer who helped build this system, and one of the key sources on that story as well, also with inside knowledge on this program, was Casey Fleming, CEO of Black Ops Partners Corp., which is an intelligence and security strategy firm. To learn more about that program, which has now been revealed publicly, and also the importance of recent stories exposing the Chinese regime's database of people outside China, we've invited Fleming to speak with us. Let's jump into that now. Hey, Casey Fleming, it's great having you back on Crossroads.
Great to be back.
So, Casey, back in 2016, you and I helped break the story about this database the Chinese Communist Party had built on Americans. Now we're seeing this story get reported just about everywhere, and again, not just Americans, but other countries as well, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, you name it. Now, I wanted to go back to the story back in 2016. Epoch Times published it. You were one of the main sources on that. And of course, you were the one who brought the story to me, actually. And I'm curious, what was it at the time that you saw? What were you hearing about the Chinese Communist Party building this database on Americans?
Well, you have to understand their strategy. The Chinese Communist Party, what their strategy is. So it's to basically defeat and destroy democracy. And they view information as power. And so it's really to collect every bit of information that they can on each individual American and then putting it into this database and then feeding that database, or at least managing that database with artificial intelligence and then feeding that into this modeling system. And so it's all of that technology, by the way, is American technology. So when you take massive troves of data on individuals and you manage it or sift it through with artificial intelligence and then point that information into this hyper modeling tool that models relationships between people, organizations, intellectual property, military, you name it. So we saw what was going on back when they actually installed the software for this very high-powered modeling system back in China, and we wanted to alert the masses to really what was going on at then. But now you've seen a lot more data points, and you can see in today's media that it's all come true.
Casey, you and I have been kind of at the forefront of this for a long time, and I know you were going around through your company trying to warn business leaders, trying to warn guys in government and military, and I know early on this was regarded as like conspiracy theory by some of them, the idea that the Chinese Communist Party may be doing things like this, that they're waging this secret war. Again, you've been at kind of the forefront of this on the business side and trying to bridge the gap between business and government. I'm curious, what are some of the issues you've run into when trying to warn people about the threat of Chinese unconventional warfare?
It's really the readiness level of the audience or the person that you're speaking to. I remember when I started in this, like over a decade ago, my learning curve, during the first few weeks is like, no, they couldn't be doing this. No, they wouldn't be doing this. No, that's impossible. Then after a couple of months of it, or at least several weeks, and then into a month or two, you're like, wow, this is amazing. And then you start lining up all the data points of all the intelligence that's happening. So it's really the learning curve and the readiness level of the audience that has to come up to speed. The question now is are they really doing it? And it's absolutely they're doing it. And we're one of the few organizations that connects the dots with all the articles as well as the intelligence that you need to make sure that it's spot on. So it's really moving forward with people to do it into baby steps, into steps, because you really can't comprehend. Americans can't comprehend. People in the free world can't comprehend that a communist regime wants to destroy their democracy and their quality of life and rule it with authoritarian rule. And everything that we do in the free society is free, and that all becomes targeted by the Chinese communist regime.
One question I get asked pretty often is, why should the average person care? A lot of people, they think, oh, well, why should I care if China has my data? Like, what are they going to do? Like, look at my browsing history? What are they going to do to me? Now, what would you tell a person who has that mentality?
It absolutely starts and begins with you as an individual, because everything you're doing on that smartphone, everything you're doing on that computer is being tracked, not only from Google and Microsoft to sell you more things, but and they sell that data. That some of those organizations sell that data to the Chinese Communist Party, to the company or corporate facades in China, which are all controlled by the CCP. So your data, I mean, they can track everything: your friends, your contacts, your phone numbers, how long you slept, where you slept, the stores you went to, basically everything on how to control you, how to identify you as an intellectual property person or to get to intellectual property, how to blackmail you. All the way to your health information. What's going on? Where you're going to this psychologist once a week. Is that for you or your children? I mean, everything that you're doing is being tracked online, on apps, on anything you do inside of an app, anything you do inside of your computer or your smartphone. So, absolutely. So it's remember, it's a communist regime that is taking your free world data to use it against you and your country to defeat democracy and to use capitalism against you to defeat your way of life. And it's not just something that's conspiracy theory. It's absolutely real. Specifically, as our country has turned up the heat on the Chinese Communist Party, you're seeing all of this start to come out, not just on a daily basis, but an hourly basis. So it's every individual is at the core of this. In fact, there was a TED talk on this that I did back in April of 2018 that actually discussed information warfare and cognitive warfare as part of the overarching unrestricted hybrid warfare, which is also named asymmetric hybrid warfare. Back to you.
Great. Now, Casey, where can people learn more about your work also?
Well, two things. We've got a website, blackopspartners.com, which goes into detail on this whole unrestricted and asymmetric hybrid warfare. Gives you, if you want more detail there, general detail. More specific detail, you can follow our company page on LinkedIn. And through that company page, we connect the dots on a daily basis. And just page through each one of those company pages, and you'll see articles that are absolutely relevant to this subject.
Now, with that said, folks, we're broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. Also, if you want to support us, as I always mention, please consider joining us on Patreon. You can find the link to our Patreon page in the description below. Also, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps this channel grow. And as always, if you want to go the extra mile, please tell a friend or family member about Crossroads, and also consider sharing this video. Now, with that said, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.